So we're taking the test on next Tuesday, right?
Yes.
So it's just the rest of the time for us to do group project?
PowerPoint. So I believe we left off, we had covered all the liquidity ratios. And so now we just need to talk about solvency and profitability. Should be coming up on it here. Okay. So when we're looking at solvency, there's a few ratios. We're just going to, I think we just have two. We're just going to look at fixed assets to long-term liabilities and liabilities to stockholder equity. Basically, you know, when we were looking at liquidity, we were looking at our current asset situation and our ability to pay off like short-term debt, our ability to deal with like accounts receivable and inventory. So liquidity ratios all dealt with current assets. Now we're looking at analyzing solvency. So solvency is more our ability to pay off long-term debt. So we're looking at, you know, paying off long-term notes payable, possibly even like bonds payable, you know, those things that we owe that maybe are bigger and then obviously further in the future. Okay. So there's really three. We just won't practice times interest earned. But you have ratio of fixed assets to long-term liabilities and ratio of liabilities to stockholders' equity. So the ratio of fixed assets to long-term liabilities just lets us know if we have enough fixed assets, like long-term assets, to cover our long-term debt. So that's important. You know, it's the same as like looking at like a secured loan or something. You know, if we go and ask for like this 30-year mortgage or on a building, do we have, you know, obviously in that case, the building itself should be worth enough to cover that loan, right? So that's like a secured loan situation. But if we borrow cash and we use that cash to invest in our company, are we investing it wisely enough that we have the assets to cover that money when it comes due? So it's just kind of looking at, again, are we able to pay or repay our debt at maturity? So we just take our net fixed assets, which net fixed assets means you're looking at, you know, like building minus accumulated depreciation and all of that, like all of your assets minus depreciation would be net assets, and divide them by long-term liabilities. Okay. So for example, you know, in this one, they're showing 2 different years. They took fixed assets of $444,500 divided by long-term liabilities of $100,000, and we had 4.4 times fixed assets compared to long-term liabilities. So we could pay off our long-term debt 4 times, like well, almost 4.5 times. So that's a pretty good, you know, ratio. Obviously, if this ratio were negative or under 1, it would kind of be like, oh, that's a little scary, you know, what our situation is. And it depends on, I know we've talked about depending on industry, it also depends on, you know, how long we've been in business. In the first couple of years, we may not have as many accumulated assets. You know, we may have more debt accumulated than we do assets, depending on how we got started and all of that. So we would look at, you know, the company as a whole. But this actually, you know, increased. We actually, if you can tell from 2015 to 2016, our fixed assets really stayed pretty close, but we actually paid off like half of our long-term liabilities. So you can see from 15 to 16, we moved into a better debt situation. Okay. And then the second one, the ratio of liabilities to equity, measures how much of our company is financed by debt and equity. Okay. So basically, it's a margin of safety for creditors. So they're looking at, is a lot of our financing in our company from debt and equity, you know, what do we really have then? You know, that combined with that ratio of fixed assets to debt really tells us a good picture. And usually they kind of correlate there. So here we just take total liabilities divided by total stockholders' equity. Okay. And this tells us how much, you know, the company is financed by debt. So it went down a little bit from 2015 to 2016. And again, this is one that would be better if it's lower. You know, the lower this ratio is, the better in this case, because that means we have less finance from debt. Okay. So out of our total equity, liabilities make up 0.4, 40%, you know, or 0.4 of our total equity. Okay, so again, depending on industry and all of that, would tell us how well we were doing. But again, in this case, the lower the number, the better. And it's under, obviously, you know, it's under 1, so that's not too bad. 0.4 is not bad at all. Okay. Time interest earned, we're not going to like practice that one, but just to go over it, it just measures the risk that interest payments will not be made if earnings decrease. So if our earnings or our net income is going down, are we still able to make interest payments on bonds? Okay. So we take income before income tax, we add in interest expense and divide by interest expense. Okay. So there, you know, the higher the ratio, the more likely interest payments will be paid if our earnings go down. So it's just a way to kind of tell us if, you know, based on our current income, if that were to go down, could we continue to pay interest payments on those bonds? Which would be important to bondholders, right? If you're taking out a bond with a company, you want to know that they had the cash flow and the ability, they were generating enough revenues to cover all the bond interest that was due, okay? So that's why it's a solvency ratio. And as you can see, from 2015 to 2016, the time interest earned for this company more than doubled. So, you know, their interest expense went down, their income before income tax went up. So they're in a better position, you know, in a solvency, they have more solvency in this case, and a better position to cover those interest payments. So if income's going up, you're going to see this ratio increasing, or if interest expense is going down. So probably what happened is we had some bonds that matured and we paid off, so we owe less interest, or other long-term debt, but usually bonds. Any questions on those? Okay, let's do the practice. If you go back into your chapter 14 practice, we are on, which one? We're on number 6. Okay, so number 6, again, we're just looking at the solvency analysis. So how is our company able, how good are we at covering long-term debt? So they gave us net fixed assets, long-term liabilities, and total stockholders' equity. Part A, ratio of fixed assets to long-term liabilities. So there we are truly just taking our net fixed assets and dividing by long-term liabilities. So 860,000 divided by 200,000. So you should get what, 4.3? Okay, so we have 4.3 times net assets over liabilities. Okay, so that, again, the higher this ratio is, the better it is. That means we have more assets than we have long-term debt. So if the company were to go under and we had to liquidate everything, we would be able to pay off all our debt and still have equity. Okay. And then ratio of liabilities to stockholders' equity. Again, this just tells us how much of our company is financed by debt and equity. So there we are going to take total liabilities by total stockholders' equity. So 600,000 divided by 250,000. And what do you get there? 2.4, good. Okay, 2.4. So there, our liabilities are 2.4 times our total equity. So that would be something we'd look at, and again, we would want to compare it to industry. It seems a little high that we have that much debt to equity. So we would want to look and see what we're doing, you know, if there's something we can do about that. It could just be that we've issued more bonds than common stock, and that may not be a bad thing, but it would be something worth looking into. So those are the only 2 solvency ones we're doing on here. Again, there's the time interest earned as well, which I think you do on your homework, but you have that there. Any questions on those? Ratios aren't too bad, right? It's just remembering the intermediate calculations sometimes.